It is one of the most countercultural and controversial disciplines of the Catholic Church, the practice of priestly celibacy. To many, it seems like an unnatural and outdated medieval rule, a source of loneliness, and a barrier to the priesthood for many good men. Why does the Church demand such a radical sacrifice? Did the first apostles, like Peter, have wives? And where in the Bible does it say that a priest cannot be married? These are fair and important questions. To answer them, we must peel back the layers of history and polemics to discover the untold history of celibacy, a story that begins not in the Middle Ages, but with the example of Jesus Christ himself and the radical calling of his first apostles. Chapter 1, The Ultimate Model, Jesus the High Priest. The entire Catholic priesthood is a participation in the one eternal priesthood of Jesus Christ. Therefore, any discussion of the nature of the priesthood must begin with him. Jesus Christ is the great high priest of the new covenant, the one who offered the perfect sacrifice of himself on the cross. And from a historical and biblical standpoint, Jesus himself was celibate. He was not married. He did not have a wife or children. This was not an accident or a matter of circumstance. It was a profound and deliberate choice that revealed the very nature of his mission. His entire life was a singular, undivided, and total gift of self to his Father for the salvation of the world. He was the bridegroom, and his one and only spouse was the Church. His spousal love was not directed toward a single person, but was poured out universally for all of humanity. The celibacy of Christ is the foundational model for the celibacy of the priest. The priest, who acts in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, is called to configure his own life as closely as possible to the life of the high priest whom he represents. By freely choosing to renounce the good of marriage and family, the priest seeks to imitate Christ's own undivided heart. His life becomes a living sign, a witness to the same total self-gift and universal spiritual fatherhood that characterized the life of Jesus. While this was an ideal, the practical and theological reasoning for this choice was articulated with stunning clarity by the Church's greatest early missionary, St. Paul. Chapter 2, The Apostolic Council, St. Paul's Teaching. The most explicit biblical text on the value of celibacy for ministry is found in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7. Paul is addressing a series of practical questions from the Corinthian community about marriage, sexuality, and the Christian life. He is clear that marriage is a good and holy vocation, but when it comes to the question of which state of life is, objectively better suited for the work of the gospel, he does not hesitate. He writes, "I want you to be free from anxieties." He then lays out the core of the argument: the unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. He says the same is true for a woman. This is not a condemnation of marriage. It is a profoundly practical and psychological insight into the nature of vocation. A married man has a sacred and beautiful duty to give his primary attention to his wife and his children. His heart is, and should be, divided between his family and his other responsibilities. But the priest, Paul argues, is called to a different kind of anxiety, an all-consuming anxiety for the things of the Lord. The celibate man is free to have a completely undivided heart. He can give himself totally to Christ and his Church. He is available to his flock 24/7. His spiritual fatherhood is not limited to a single family, but is open to the entire parish community. Paul concludes his argument by saying, "I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord." This undivided devotion is the biblical and pastoral heart of the argument for clerical celibacy. It is a practical choice for the sake of a more radical and available ministry. Chapter 3. The Example of the Apostles, the Untold Truth. But what about Peter? This is the immediate and most common objection. The Gospels say he had a mother-in-law, which means he was married. Doesn't this prove that priests and even popes can be married? This is a crucial question, and the answer reveals a key part of the untold history of celibacy. The Church has always acknowledged that some of the apostles, including Peter, were married before they were called by Christ. However, the Church's ancient and consistent tradition is that once they answered Christ's call to leave everything and follow me, this included a commitment to a life of continence, that is, abstaining from sexual relations with their wives in order to dedicate themselves completely to their new mission. This is a critical distinction that is often lost in the modern debate. The question is not just about the state of being married, but about the discipline of sexual abstinence for the sake of the kingdom. The early church saw a precedent for this in the Old Testament priesthood. The Levitical priests were required to abstain from relations with their wives during their period of service in the temple, in order to be ritually pure to offer the sacrifice. The early church fathers reasoned, if the priests of the Old Covenant, who offered the sacrifices of animals, were required to practice temporary continence, how much more should the priests of the New Covenant, who offer the very body and blood of Christ himself, live a life of perpetual continence? This apostolic tradition of continence is attested to by numerous church fathers. By the 4th century, this unwritten apostolic tradition began to be codified into written law. The practice of the early church was not about forbidding married men from becoming priests, but about requiring any priest, married or not, to live a life of perfect continence out of respect for the sacredness of the altar and for the sake of that undivided devotion that St. Paul had championed. The biblical and apostolic evidence therefore points not to a mandatory rule of being unmarried, but to a powerful and consistent ideal. The perfect model of Christ was celibacy. The practical counsel of St. Paul was celibacy for the sake of undivided ministry. And the traditional example of the married apostles was perfect continence after they began their ministry. This was the spiritual and theological soil from which the formal discipline of mandatory celibacy in the Latin Church would eventually grow. But how did this apostolic ideal, this unwritten tradition of continence, transform over the next few centuries into a formal, binding, and written law for all clergy? The answer is found in the witness of the early church councils. Chapter 4, the first written laws. As the church emerged from the age of Roman persecution in the 4th century, she began the work of organizing her internal life and codifying the traditions that had been passed down orally for generations. One of the first and most pressing issues was the conduct of the clergy. The earliest known written law regarding clerical continence comes from the Council of Elvira in Spain. Around the year 306 AD, Canon 33 of this council is stark and unambiguous. It decreed, "We decree that all bishops, priests and deacons and all clerics engaged in the ministry are to abstain completely from their wives and not to have children. Whoever does so shall be excluded from the clerical state." This is a monumental piece of historical evidence. It shows that at the very beginning of the 4th century, in the Western Church, the apostolic tradition of clerical continence was not only known and practiced, but was now being formally and legally enforced with the strictest of penalties, removal from the priesthood. This was not an isolated or rogue council. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, a series of other local councils and papal decrees reaffirmed this same discipline. The Council of Carthage in 390 AD, for example, spoke of the need for those who serve the altar to be continent in all things, so that what the apostles taught and what antiquity itself observed, we also may hold. The popes of this era, such as Pope Siricius, wrote letters to other bishops insisting on the enforcement of this discipline, always framing it not as a new rule, but as an ancient and apostolic tradition that needed to be restored. The trajectory in the Latin West was clear and consistent. The unwritten apostolic ideal was becoming the written law of the Church. Chapter 5. The Developing Divide, East and West. To tell this story honestly, we must acknowledge a divergence in practice that developed between the Western, Latin-speaking Church and the Eastern, Greek-speaking Church. This is a difference in discipline, not in dogma, and it continues to this day. The Eastern churches, which today include the various Orthodox churches and the Eastern Catholic churches in communion with Rome, also held the ideal of a celibate clergy in the highest esteem. However, their legal tradition developed differently. The definitive Eastern position was established at the Council in Trullo in 692 AD. This council decreed that while bishops must be celibate monks, men who were already married could be validly ordained to the priesthood and the diaconate. These married priests could continue to live with their wives, but they were required to practice temporary continence, abstaining from marital relations for a period of time before they celebrated the divine liturgy. The Western Church, on the other hand, continued to move in the direction set by the Council of Elvira. It increasingly insisted not just on continence after ordination, but on celibacy, being unmarried before ordination. Why the difference? Historians and theologians point to several factors, but a central one was the different conception of the priest's role. In the West, the priest was increasingly seen as a spiritual monk for the world, a man set apart whose entire life was a sacred offering. This difference in discipline, however, should not obscure the fundamental unity in principle. Both East and West recognize that a cleric, when he approaches the holy altar, must be in a state of sanctified continence, and both agreed that the highest order of the priesthood, the episcopate, must be reserved for celibate men. Chapter 6. The Gregorian Reform and the Crisis of the Middle Ages. The discipline of celibacy in the West faced its greatest historical crisis in the early Middle Ages, from the 9th to the 11th centuries. Following the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, Europe entered a period of political chaos. In the absence of strong central authority, the Church fell under the control of local feudal lords, kings, and powerful families. This practice, known as lay investiture, meant that secular rulers, not the Church, were appointing bishops and priests. This led to a catastrophic decline in clerical morality. Church offices were no longer given to the most holy and learned men, but were bought and sold to the highest bidder, a sin known as simony. Bishops became feudal lords and priests became local functionaries. In this environment of profound corruption, the discipline of clerical celibacy almost completely collapsed. Many priests, bishops, and even popes of this era openly took wives or concubines, a practice called Nicolaitism. This was not just a problem of personal sin. It was a threat to the very structure of the Church. These clerics began to treat their parishes and dioceses as private hereditary property, to be passed down to their own sons. The clergy was becoming a landed hereditary caste, their primary loyalty given to their family and their feudal lord, not to God and the Church. In the middle of the 11th century, a powerful and transformative reform movement erupted from the heart of the Church, led by a series of holy and determined popes, chief among them Pope St. Gregory VII. This Gregorian reform had one central goal: to purify the Church and to free it from the control of the secular world. And a central pillar of this reform was the vigorous and relentless enforcement of clerical celibacy. The reformers saw celibacy not as an arbitrary rule, but as the essential key to restoring the integrity of the priesthood. A celibate priest was a free priest, free from worldly allegiances, free to belong entirely to God and His Church, and free to be a true spiritual father to his flock. Chapter 7. The Lateran Councils and the Definitive Law. The Gregorian Reform was a turning point, but the final definitive legal statement on celibacy in the Western Church would come in the 12th century. The First Lateran Council in 1123, the first ecumenical council to be held in the West, decreed that marriages attempted by those in holy orders were illicit or unlawful. But the truly groundbreaking declaration came 16 years later, at the Second Lateran Council in 1139. This council, building on the work of the reformers, made a crucial and definitive legal move. It declared that for a man in holy orders, from the subdiaconate and above, a subsequent attempt at marriage was not just illicit, but invalid. It was, in the eyes of the Church, not a marriage at all. This was the final and definitive codification of the law of mandatory clerical celibacy in the Latin Rite. From this point forward, the question of a married priesthood in the West was legally settled. The long historical journey from an unwritten apostolic tradition to the first local laws, through the crisis of the Dark Ages and forged in the fire of the Gregorian Reform, was complete. The Church had made a definitive choice for a celibate priesthood, a choice that it has maintained for nearly 900 years since. The long and often difficult journey from the apostolic ideal of continence to the definitive law of celibacy at the Second Lateran Council was complete. History shows that the discipline was forged in the fires of persecution, clarified by councils, and ultimately utilized as a powerful instrument of spiritual reform to free the church from corruption and worldliness. But is that the whole story? Is priestly celibacy merely a practical historical discipline, a rule that could be changed? Or does it point to a deeper, more profound and timeless spiritual truth about the very nature of the priesthood itself? To answer that, we must look beyond history and into the very heart of the mystery of the priest, to understand who he is called to be, both for the church and for the world. Chapter 8. The priest as alter Christus, an icon of the bridegroom. The deepest meanings of priestly celibacy are not disciplinary, but theological. They flow from the very identity of the priest. The Church teaches that through the sacrament of holy orders, the priest is configured to Christ in a special way. He is not just a minister or a functionary. He becomes an alter Christus, another Christ, and acts in persona Christi Capitis, which is Latin for in the person of Christ the head. When the priest consecrates the Eucharist or grants absolution in the confessional, it is Christ himself who is acting through him. Given this profound identification with Christ, the Church sees a beautiful fittingness in the priest, imitating Christ's own state of life. As we established, Jesus Christ, the great high priest, was celibate. He was the divine bridegroom, and his one and only spouse for whom he shed his blood was the Church. His entire life was an act of total spousal self-gift to his bride. By embracing celibacy, the priest makes his own life a more powerful and living icon of Christ the bridegroom. His renunciation of a natural marriage allows him to be married to the Church in a unique and total way. His life becomes a visible sign of the spousal love that Christ has for his people. As Pope Paul VI wrote in his powerful encyclical on priestly celibacy, Sacerdotalis Celibatus, celibacy proclaims the presence on earth of a new finality. It is a sign of the freedom which is totally dedicated to the service of the Lord and his work. The priest's celibacy is a constant, silent sermon, preaching with his very life that Christ's love for the Church is a total, faithful, and life-giving love. Chapter 9. The power of spiritual fatherhood. This spousal relationship with the Church is what gives birth to the priest's greatest gift, his spiritual fatherhood. A common modern objection to celibacy is that it prevents a man from becoming a father. The Catholic understanding is the exact opposite. Celibacy does not eliminate a priest's fatherhood. It universalizes it. A married man is called to a beautiful and holy vocation, to pour out his life in a particular love for his wife and the children they may have. This is a noble and demanding path, but the priest is called to a different kind of love. By freely renouncing the particular good of a natural family, he is liberated to love with a universal heart. His undivided devotion, which St. Paul spoke of, allows him to be a spiritual father to everyone in his parish. He is a father to the young couple he prepares for marriage, to the infant he baptizes, to the child he gives First Holy Communion, to the teenager he counsels in the confessional, to the sick he anoints, and to the elderly he comforts at their deathbed. His family is the entire flock entrusted to his care. His heart is not divided. He is available to his spiritual children at any hour of the day or night, ready to bring them the sacraments and the mercy of God. His celibacy is not an emptiness, but a profound fullness. It is a sacrifice of a natural fatherhood for the sake of a supernatural fatherhood that is open to hundreds, or even thousands of souls. Chapter 10. The Eschatological Sign, a witness to the world to come. We now arrive at the deepest, most mystical, and most profound meaning of priestly celibacy. It is not just about imitating Christ or being a spiritual father. At its core, priestly celibacy is a powerful, prophetic, and eschatological sign. The word eschatological simply means related to the end times or the ultimate reality of heaven. Jesus himself gives us a glimpse into this ultimate reality. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, the Sadducees try to trap him with a question about marriage in the resurrection. Jesus answers them with a stunning revelation about our heavenly destiny. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. This is a crucial truth. Earthly marriage, as beautiful and as holy as it is as a sacrament, is a reality for this world only. It is a temporary sign that points toward a greater reality. Our ultimate destiny is not marriage to another human being, but the wedding feast of the Lamb described in the book of Revelation, the eternal, ecstatic, and complete union of our souls with God Himself in the beatific vision. The celibate priest, by renouncing the good of earthly marriage, becomes a living, breathing witness to this ultimate reality. He lives the life of heaven now on earth. His celibacy is a constant silent sermon that proclaims to a world obsessed with earthly pleasures and relationships that this life is not all there is. His life is a signpost, pointing us toward our true home, our ultimate love, and our everlasting destiny. He reminds us that our hearts were made for a union so profound that no earthly marriage could ever completely satisfy it. The priest's life is a prophetic statement that the love we seek in our spouses is just a foretaste of the infinite ocean of love that awaits us in God. In this sense, the celibate priest is a man of the future, a living icon of the world to come. Final conclusion. We began with a simple but challenging question. Why can't Catholic priests marry? Our journey took us back beyond the Middle Ages, to the very origins of the faith. We discovered in Part 1 the deep biblical and apostolic roots of this practice, founded on the perfect, celibate example of Christ the High Priest and the pastoral counsel of St. Paul. In Part 2, we traced the untold history of how this apostolic ideal of continence was forged, through centuries of councils and reforms, into a binding discipline for the Latin Church as a means of ensuring the priest's total dedication and freedom. Finally, we have now uncovered the threefold profound theological meaning of this sacrifice. The celibate priest stands as a more powerful icon of Christ the bridegroom, who gave himself completely for his bride, the Church. He is liberated for a universal spiritual fatherhood, with a heart undivided for his entire flock. And he is a prophetic eschatological sign for the world, a living witness to our ultimate destiny, the eternal wedding feast of heaven. Priestly celibacy, therefore, is not an empty lack, but a profound and radical form of love, a freely chosen gift of self for the sake of the kingdom of God.